the work that I create is within the realms of Afrofuturism, which is very much about creative storytelling from an Afrocentric perspective and inspired by Afrocentric cultures, Afrocentric resources. So that includes cultures, people, land, history, geography. And so my work is very much multi-layered aspects of combination of research, but then also a combination of being inspired by what I consider to be my ancestors and divine powers, but then also just me channeling my inner child, essentially. And so this image that you're looking at, it's called Untitled, but it is actually the cover from my book that I co-edited with the amazing Dr. Audrey Hudson. And the book is called Cosmic Underground Northside, which I'll speak about a little bit more. So there's a couple key words that I want to just really highlight real quick that we're gonna be speaking about and that we're gonna be, I'm gonna be using repetitively. And so the first one is Innerstand. And it's not a word that I would say I invented, but I published a definition of it from my own understanding. And so essentially it's a spiritual level of comprehension similar to wisdom or ancestral knowledge, but it's different from having instinct, you know, or instancy. And overstand is a level of comprehension that allows one to utilize information and transfer that. So these are two words that I got from my own cultural background of being of Jamaican descent. And we often use these words frequently and oftentimes interchangeably, but it is very different from saying that you understand something, because when you say you understand something, you're saying that the information is above you, essentially. And when you say you overstand something, that means you are standing on top of that information and you can kind of direct what to do with that information. And then when you say you understand something, it's really saying that you can, this information is coming from a deeper place, you know, and it resonates in a deeper place. And so for me, the work that I create comes from a place of understanding that I have a message that I want to share to the world, of thinking about a future where it's inclusive and thinking about a future where we all have a place in it. And but it's also coming from an understanding that we also need to see positive representations of people of African descent. Granted that for such a long time, we have only seen negative representation. And so Afrofuturism 2.0 is, sorry, Imagineering is a really interesting term that I thought I came up with. And I was really displeased, I will admit. I was displeased to find out that Disney actually trademarked the term. And it's actually a very old term. I just thought I was clever when I used it the first time. But essentially, it's combining the word imagine and engineering. And it's a practice and application of conceptual inventions of technology designs and potential function. And so it is really like just about conceptual thinking. And Walt Disney often felt like he was an Imagineer who often created worlds, who created stories, even though they may not have really planned out ways of functioning, you know, like how does magic work in Disney World, you know? You don't have to explain that, you just jump from A to Z and leave out the rest of the alphabets, essentially. So Afrofuturism 2.0 kind of takes Innerstand and Overstand and Imagineering and apply it to thinking about the future for people of African descent. And it's a term that was popularized by Mark Derry in 1993 and redefined by Dr. Ronaldo Anderson in 2016. It currently is understood to refer to any type of Pan-African storytelling practices that is informed by African resources, as I mentioned earlier. Now, Sankophonology is a term that I brought to light. In academia, they encourage us use the term coin. But I would just say, like, you know, I helped to unveil the term, and essentially it comes from an Afrocentric word that originates in Ghana from the Akan people, meaning to go and fetch and bring that which you forgot. And so the word is Sankofa, and Sankofa is a part of a system of semiotics, so meaning signs and symbols that predates colonial influences and actually are very ancient systems where the symbols often tell a parable and often tells a story about kingdoms. And Sankofa is a kingdom that actually was about reclaiming one's roots and connection to the earth and their spirituality. And so in this kingdom, they wanted to remind the people that this is what the kingdom stood for. And so this is a very popular term, Sankofa, and it's a very popular symbol, which is represented by a bird with its egg in its mouth. And I'll actually show you the symbol later on in this talk. But now Sankophonology is essentially the study and understanding and understanding and overstanding of how people have practiced Sankofa. And so a movie that I was very much inspired by in 1993 is called Sankofa, with an amazing dub poet named Muta Baruka. And in that movie, we see the protagonist actually travel back in time to the days of slavery, and she was transported to Cape Coast, where she was reliving the Middle Passage and actually going into slavery. And so there was this time travel aspect. And so the other part of Sankophonology is actually understanding that time is not linear, as is taught in Eurocentric education, but the Afrocentric understanding of time is that time overlaps. And so we understand it now, and we understand this now, and we overstand this concept now through the internet. So actually right now I see some participants who are actually in UK. I see a couple folks in Germany, and we are all experiencing this talk right now in real time in our reality, but based on time, we're actually in different time zones. So I believe Germany is 6 hours after the time zone that I'm in right now, but yet we're experiencing this phenomenon of engaging in real time. And so there's an essay that I wrote in the Cosmic Underground book that I was speaking about earlier, and I'll speak about later on, that kind of explains how I got this term from elders in Ghana and how I was encouraged to use this knowledge within the realms of Afrofuturism and within my own practice. And yes, it's definitely related to indigenous concept of time being circular. And so the two other terms that I'm going to be focusing on throughout this talk is orthography and technofossils. Now, orthography really very much relates to Sankophonology, and right now within my academia work, I am actually looking to bridge those worlds together and essentially prove that by default, Afrofuturists are essentially orthographers. And orthography is a methodology that doesn't look at an artist, researcher, and teacher being a separate entity, but essentially being one whole. And within that, there is something called 6 renderings that happens within orthography. But the main aspect of orthography is the living inquiry. And so in my work, there's something that I call the speculative middle, which is a term that I got from Rita Irwins and also from Anita Sinner, an amazing, two amazing professors who inspired me greatly within orthography and who are the leaders, some of the leaders within orthography. And essentially that space, the speculative middle, is where we create questions, where we create inquiries and create ways of thinking, which I'll speak to a little bit more further. And technofossils is a really interesting term that I came across that really informed my work. And essentially it is any human-made artifact that will outlive a normal human's lifespan. And so when the term was first introduced, it was actually referring to cell phones, how cell phones essentially is a collection of our data and information, but because it's made out of plastics and different human-made elements, these things don't decompose. So you can drop a cell phone in a brick of cement, and it's kind of like a time capsule at that point, because someone can still retrieve that data, that information about you. And so this idea of technofossils really inspired my work, and I'll speak about how. So my work within Afrofuturism and as a teacher or as an artographer is, again, really about layering information and layering ways of creating speculative middles. So creating a way for people to ask questions and to get curious. And I realized this was something that I was interested in, because when I first was introduced to the idea of Black people being in the future, my mind instantly was open, and all these ideas of how we could exist in the future started to flood my existence. And now I realize at that moment and throughout my adolescence, essentially, and going into my adulthood, that this entry into Afrofuturism really inspired me, because I saw so many ways that I was being told that Black people won't be in the future. And I think of movies like Space Odyssey, 2001, even like Star Wars, the early Star Wars, and like even like horror movies and all these different movies where the Black character either is not in the movie, you know, like Blade Runner, or they die early in the movie. And it's just like, yo, why are we always getting sacrificed, you know? And so when I saw a movie called The Fifth Element, when I was 7 years old, my mind was blown. It was my first time seeing Black people in the future. And also, it was my first time seeing a diverse representation of Blackness. And so it had me thinking of so many different ways and so many different possibilities. And so, you know, we had the first Black president in The Fifth Element. I fell in love with the lady with the dreads, even though the character who was playing her wasn't of African descent. It was just this idea of like dreadlocks being in the future, you know, and I now have dreadlocks, and I had dreadlocks when I was 7 years old. So it was just like, whoa, like, oh my God. And then, you know, just seeing a flamboyant metrosexual male was also just like really mind-boggling as well, because at the time there was a lot of hyper toxic masculinity represented in hip-hop and also represented in the media, and a lot of negative things were being said about Black men during that time period. 1997 was also during the time period where there was a lot of violence within hip-hop and just within the communities, Black communities globally, especially in Toronto. And so this idea of just us existing in the future really made me look and change my perspective and look at my reality at a time really differently. Also, shout out to Stacey McKenzie, who I had a crush on when I was younger as well, who was in that movie, Fifth Element. That's her in the corner. So I wanted to show you also this other clip that, like, to this day, it tickles my insides.
We need some heat here, man. Get some heat. Some heat over here, man. What you think, man? Put the heat over here, man. Thank you very much. Come. Give it. Take that.
Way before. It's a human. Really? Yeah!
I've tried everything, so believe me, there's no other way of getting on this plane.
it just had me cracking up, just the idea of like, you know, again, Black people being in the future. So another book that really opened my mind was Octavia Butler's book, Seed to Harvest, which is actually a collection of novels, all encompassing one. And so within that collection, there's a book called Pattern Master. And in that book, it speaks about people of African descent having these telekinetic abilities and telekinesis abilities where they can move things with their minds, but also they can communicate with each other telepathically. And there was one particular person, and these are like offspring of the offsprings of these original people who had these abilities, and they call them artists. And essentially, one artist in this book, who goes by the name of Laro, had that ability to take your emotions, take your memories, and put it into an object. And whoever comes in contact with that object can then relive those memories and can then relive and feel those emotions. And so this blew my mind. And it blew my mind because it made me look at monuments differently. Because it made me realize, what if monuments are actually time capsules of memory? What if it's time capsules of being able to re-experience someone's lived experiences? And so that's kind of sent me into a rabbit hole, because in my neighborhood of where I grew up and where I was born, in Rexdale, Etobicoke, in the northwest end of Toronto, there were no public monuments that resembled anyone of African descent. And in my research, when I was attending OCAD University, I realized when I was doing a survey of actually trying to find monuments that were of people of African descent in the city of Toronto, I found none. And that was in 2010. And so essentially I became really interested in this idea of using monuments as a technofossil, as an object that is a time capsule that tells a story, and essentially the story of people of African descent. Because how else could you preserve and say that Black people belong in the future if it's not represented in the landscape as everyone else? And so it was really interesting for me, because when I traveled to different parts of the world, places like South Africa, to Ghana, to throughout the Caribbean, there were so many monuments that I saw that actually preserved the everyday life of people, you know, that kind of told the story of the everyday person, not just a story of war heroes, not just a story of just like really prominent political figures or military figures. In Jamaica, there was images of like, not images, but statues. Like, for example, where my family's from in Clarendon, in the city Maypen, which is the main city of that parish, there is Market Anne, you know, or Auntie Anne. And Auntie Anne is literally a statue of a woman pounded yam, you know, because that's what the marketplace is for. You know, people go there, they buy food, et cetera, produce, et cetera. And so it's like preserving like this really important aspect of the culture, which was agriculture. And so I thought that was really beautiful, because when I went to Ghana, I saw something very similar. And when I went to South Africa, when I went to Zimbabwe, I saw very similar things. And even when I went to, like, you know, other places like Peru, et cetera, people of the culture represented their history. And so I thought it was really interesting that, granted the fact that Canada has such a rich history of contributions by people of African descent, were often left out of the conversation of being preserved in the future. And so I kind of set out to create these digital monuments and these digital art pieces that kind of preserve these stories. And so this art piece really took it a step further, where I started to look more into extended animation and to extended reality, which is known as XR. But before I even talk about XR work, I'm gonna speak more about my digital work and then my AR work. So my digital work started off as making collages, digital collages, where I was taking monuments in real life and collaging them into a futuristic type scenarios. And so this monument that you see here is of the Honorable Excellent Marcus Messiah Garvey, which is considered as Jamaica's first national hero. And it's set in a landscape that's kind of like a combination of just, people who have a certain understanding of channeling their spiritual abilities, hence why they have glowing eyes. But they're kind of just like every day passing by, you have one young lady getting her hair done, which is something that you'll just see in the everyday community of Black folks. And then, you have an elder, we have someone just holding the banner of the red, black, and green flag to represent liberation. And then we have, a market woman, we have another woman who's holding drums. So different aspects that I felt like was important to be in a futuristic representation, just like how I saw in The Fifth Element. But a lot of my work started to shift towards wanting to represent young people. And for me, I wanted to really create work that allowed young people to see themselves in the future, because for me, growing up, like I said, I saw a lot of people dying. I saw a lot of negative imagery of Black people, of young people on the TV screen. And essentially it felt like we never had a tomorrow. We just only had today. We have to live for today. And unfortunately, I became a byproduct of that thinking, where I started to make unwise decisions, where I found myself in a lot of predicaments where I could have lost my life, or someone could have got really badly injured, all because I felt like I had to live for the moment and live in that moment, and I never had a tomorrow. And so I wanted to create art pieces and monuments for young people, just to say, like, you are valued, your narrative in this present moment is important. You don't have to do something granular. Just your existence in itself is something worth praising and something worth preserving for future generations. And so this art piece is called Wata No Get Enemy. And it's an interesting art piece that I made. I know I shouldn't be calling my own art piece interesting, but I'm calling it interesting anyways, because the way the concept came up to me was inspired by a song by Fela Kuti. And the song is named the same thing as the art piece. And essentially in the song, he was saying, like, you can't not be an ally to water, because everything water is everything that you are, the human body is made up over 70% of water. And so essentially it's like, yes, water can be destruction, but it's also creation. And essentially we need it to exist. And so essentially it's my commentary on how I felt like young Black youth were under attack, where I felt like young Black youth were being let down by different systems, from the political system to the justice system to the education system and beyond. And so I wanted to say, like, you can't be our enemy, because without the youth, there's no future. And so Wata No Get Enemy is essentially saying young people, young Black people is our water of society, and so I put them in a futuristic landscape. It's almost dystopian, but it's almost also a sense of hope, hence why I kind of give it that sunset type feel. And then essentially this art piece was meant to be a living inquiry, because I want young people to see it. I want all people to see it and start asking questions. Why this? Why that? Why why that plinth? Why these two young people set in this ways, And so essentially this is one of my pieces that I like to use in my workshops. Well, greetings, Zainab. Zainab is also an amazing writer who wrote the introduction to the Cosmic Underground North Side. So this is another piece called Queen's Park. In Queen's Park of the city of Toronto, there is a statue, a monument of Sir Edward IV, I believe, or fifth, or one of them. And essentially, he was a very controversial colonial figure, a true, thorough bigot, who was known for annihilation of a lot of indigenous people and being in full support of slavery and the enslavement of Black folks and the mistreatment of people of African descent and just people of color in general. And he has tons of monuments, not only in Toronto. He has about 3 monuments in Toronto, but also he has monuments across the world, wherever the British Empire colonized. And in the middle of Queen's Park, he sits on his horse. And I wondered, what it would have been like back in 2016. What happens if someone destroyed this monument? There was actually an art piece where someone actually took a replica of the statue and threw it in the Don River. And so I was wondering, if so happened in 2016, someone brought this monument down, what would be something interesting, something meaningful that would replace it? And so I created this trans woman, this trans mother who I know, who has a child, and essentially was saying to me in a conversation that they saw Black women as the workhorses of society. And that sparked my mind. I was like, whoa, And the person's horoscope is a Centaurian. And so I was like, yo, I've never seen a Centaurian with an African, of African descent, an African combination. And so when I started to do my research, I realized that there are folklores and there are mythologies of African cultures of half human, half horse people, but I've just never seen it. And so I decided to use this commentary of Black women, Black trans women, being the workhorses of society and being the caretakers of society who drive society forward. And I was like, yo, this will actually be an interesting replacement for Sir Edward's monument. And so I had this art piece that I created, and it's actually an animation and a augmented reality piece that actually existed for about 2 years, that if you went to Queen's Park and you held your phone up using a certain app that no longer exists, unfortunately, you would actually see in the place of the actual monument, this monument. And essentially what it consists of is just telling the story of the trans mother. And so I put all these little accents, I would call it, that tells her stories and things that are interesting to them. And so the fact that they love wearing Jordans, specifically Jordan 11s, which were known as the Space Jams shoes. They owned like 6 pairs of them. So I thought it was interesting to put a different pair on each foot. And so then also they loved Prince, and around that time Prince passed away. So you have Prince's symbol, formerly known as the symbol, and so also representing that Sir Edward's symbol is now no longer what we once know it as, and now it's something else, and then yeah, so just different aspects. They love Power Ranger and this idea of like transformation, the Power Ranger transforming to become empowered, and then how they transferred their own understanding of who they believe to be and how that empowered them. And so just, again, multiple layers of living inquiry. So this is another art piece of mine, and I apologize that I didn't label these art pieces. But this is called Kinas Ascension. And Kiana was a young lady who, she got kicked out of a lot of schools. She got kicked out of for like fighting, just not going to class, etc., etc. And she was in one of my workshops, and she was just so brilliant, like just the way she thought, and her ability to hear music was just like not just music but melody. And she got into beat making and became a composer in the workshop. And essentially the workshop was with an organization called Lost Lyrics, supported by the amazing Amanda Paris, who I call my big sister. And Kiana was a person who, we like to say that when she when you cross her or when you get her upset, she's someone who takes flight, you know, like she goes from 0 to 100 in the sense of like she's had a quick temper. And so it was interesting to channel that energy, you know what I mean, that passion that she has when someone does her wrong, and transfer that into art making, you know. And so when she really started to learn how to make music, she literally took flight. Like she just became so passionate about it. And so again, these hints that I put into this art piece where I gave her wings, you know, but the mechanical wings. And it's like this idea like she takes flight like a jet. And you know, the idea that you hear a jet before you see it. So you kind of hear what she's about before you even see her, you know, because her music was just so amazing. So you kind of know that this young lady is filled of passion when you hear the music that she produces. And then, you know, I put a device by her ear saying that, like, you know, she kind of like created her own technological way of hearing. So again, monuments preserving stories, you know, that's what my work became about. And so I made this art piece in 2017. And so I wanted to really preserve this process and preserve this work beyond the digital means. And so I created this book called The Cosmic Underground Northside, an incantation of Black speculative understandings. And so this book was meant to document, you know, the movement of Afrofuturism and those who are essentially preserving stories and preserving really creative ways that we are engaging and encouraging people to think about the future and Black people's existence in the future. And so again, shouts to Zainab, who wrote the foreword, such a beautiful foreword, and Nalo Hawkinson, who's considered like the godmother of Canadian Afrofuturism. And so what made this book really interesting, and I know I'm using interesting a lot, but what made it really intriguing is that it's a Canadian perspective of Afrofuturism, which is about coexistence. And so once I created this book, my world shifted because I met someone named Anita Sinner, who was my professor at Concordia University, and she encouraged me not to stop there. Like, you know, the book was not enough. Having the methodology of Sankophonology wasn't enough. She encouraged me to take it further. And that's where artography comes in and the augmented reality work that I started to create. And so the artography aspect is really understanding myself as not only as an educator, not only as an artist, but also seeing them all encapsulated as one. And so that what led me into really diving into the world of augmented reality. And so I'm gonna quickly breeze through this presentation that I made for school that speaks more about my work within artography and see myself as an artographer. And so in 2020, last year, I created an augmented reality piece that was all about, again, living inquiry. And I wanted to create something that essentially lived without my support. And so I was a part of something called the Monument Lab Fellows. And as one of the fellows, I was encouraged to create a project that was a counter monument, but also a way to create conversation that was dialogical, meaning that it was opposing to that which already existed. So how do I challenge monuments that already exist and encourage inquiry? And so counter monument is a term that speaks to a monument that directly opposes something else. And so I realized just alone creating Afrofuturistic monuments, so creating monuments of people of African descent, but within a scientific or science fiction or speculative fiction context, was counter monument. It was a way of challenging already our existing monuments of Black people that already exist in the world, but also existing monuments of colonial figures. And so I started to really dive into this world of augmented reality and extended reality. Now, extended reality essentially is the combination of virtual reality and augmented reality. And so what happens is when you use a device, and I encourage y'all to use and check out this website, Black Technofossils. But when you use the device, you almost enter into this virtual world that I created. And so this was really a change and shifting point, because it was me combining my artistic hat, but then also my researcher hat and my teacher hat, because by using this augmented reality and extended reality work, essentially you are now becoming an artographer. And what I mean by that is that you are now creating questions within yourself on how to use this augmented reality. How do you engage with your own reality, so your own space? But then also it's like you are now creating your own work with my artistic work. And so the way this works is that I did a walking tour, virtual walking tour with the Goethe Institute, one in Toronto and one in Montreal. Because I love Montreal, I'm gonna focus on the Montreal site. And so I gave the audience, my participants, 6 choices of places that they can visit and use the augmented reality to engage with the space and learn about the history through the augmented reality. And so essentially I'm using the art piece as a teacher. And so this was really cool because I got to do virtual tours with students around the city of Montreal. And then I did another session with folks in Chicago. And I been to Chicago maybe 2 times. And it's safe to say I don't know Chicago well enough to lead you on a tour. And so it's really cool to then have students use this work, this augmented reality work, and walk around their cities and engage with the work. And so if you visit this website, blacktechnofossils.com or .ca, you can actually see some of the videos and examples of some of the walking tours that I hosted. And you'll see that all right here. And I want to encourage you all to visit this website and try it out and see how you create living inquiries. What are the questions that come up for you when you oppose one living object or monument in your real world with this virtual monument? And so I'm gonna wrap this talk up just speaking about this. And also people feel free to ask questions, use the Q&A, so I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. I know I'm not talking to myself. But this augmented reality piece that I created called Ancestral Technofossil, it's, again, really the height of my actualization as an artographer, but also being an Afrofuturist and combining those worlds, because I was thinking of, in my research of monuments of people of African descent, I've never seen a monument just a tribute to African ancestors. And so I was really intrigued by this idea of like how people within different African cultures use masks and figurines and sculptures to represent not just one ancestor, but a multitude of ancestors, because recognizing that there's no one ancestor that guides you. You are part of a lineage of people who came before you, and also a lineage of people who come after you, who protect you and guide you and inspire you. And so in that way of thinking, oftentimes the masks that you see within African cultures are not always exactly figurative. They're interpretive, they're speculative, they're imagineered. And so I wanted to create a monument, a futuristic monument that was part cyborg, part traditional African mask, and then part imaginative. And so I was speaking about the Sankofa bird. And so I represented one mask being the Sankofa bird, being the mask of Sankofa, which is on the side of the future, and a traditional Ivory Coast mask on the side of the present. And again, it's my commentary of saying these ancestors, these people are still with us. And so again, the counter monument aspect is I'm leading folks to colonial sites. And so it's interesting to have a conversation with ancestors, representations of ancestors in those sites of inquiries. So for example, I had a site in Montreal that is of Maisonneuve in the Place of Arms, Place d'Armes. And in the Place of Arms, this was actually a place where slave blocks were once held. So the Place of Arms means it's a place of trade. And right in front of the church, they used to sell slaves. Actually, Angelique Joseph was actually one of the slaves who was sold at a Place of Arms, in Montreal. And so I thought it would be interesting that to contrast Maisonneuve's statue and monument that actually has what they call the forefathers of Montreal, and it has an indigenous person represented. It has a white settler, European French woman represented, and it had Sir Sieg represented, but there's no representation of Matthew da Costa. There's no representation of all the African explorers who actually first created the treaties with the indigenous people and the indigenous population before Samuel du Champlain. And so I thought it would be really interesting to create this space of inquiry, or again, this idea of speculative middles. So I see that we have a question, so I'm just gonna get into the question. And so where do you see the future of your artistic practice? What goals do you have for yourself? Thank you for that question, AC Mensa. So for me, the next step is, again, like I said, augmented reality and extended reality, because I would like to see more educators, more artographers using augmented reality within the education system, especially during this pandemic time where students have to stay at home. It's like, okay, how do you continue to create these modes of engagement? As I said, I did this walking tour, this virtual walking tour with this augmented reality tool that I created in several different capacities. And because I'm thinking of openings and different ways that I can create living inquiry through Afrofuturism, it creates an open canvas that allows multiple people to access ways to learn through one art piece. And so if different educators were to use augmented reality or just to even follow just even this means of using AR technology, I believe that we can actually change the education system in a lot of ways, and we can actually create more ways to help our youth who are struggling within the education system. So with that said, I'm gonna wrap this up, and I wanna thank you all for listening to what I have to say and to learn a little bit about my work. And I hope you check out the websites, Black Technofossils, and learn more about Afrofuturism and just thinking about Black people in the future and being a part of the living inquiry.
I wanted to maybe start off by asking the work of analyzing monuments and giving a more expansive story related to monuments is colossal, right? It's huge. And I wonder, I know that the Monument Lab exists, and I know that there's amazing work being done with regard to this analysis and creating works that can sort of either stand next to a monument as an alternative narrative, or there's also the work of, in some cases, taking monuments away, right? And we, in Kitchener-Waterloo area, we had a monument in a rural community close to us in Baden, a statue of Johnny MacDonald recently removed. And when I looked at that, like as I'm watching that in the media, I thought of the removal of the statue as like a sketch, like an absolute, like, you know, one line on a piece of paper. The removal of the statue was sort of one way to start. And since it's been removed, there's been nothing that's come in to fill in that void. And I think that your work is an answer to that, and all the work of the Monument Lab and the people who are related to you as colleagues. And I guess my question to you is how how could I, as an arts administrator here in KW, create a situation in which there could be a response that would be thoughtful and meaningful?
So, and this is why I love artography, because again, I keep using the term living inquiry, and it's essentially like, how do you facilitate an experience where you're encouraging questions to be asked, right? And it's like, it's, you know, now I'm putting my art educator hat on, where you're essentially using a constructivist approach, right? So you're meeting your students, you're meeting your participants, you're meeting your viewers where they're at, and you're building on that knowledge that they already have. Essentially, I give prompts for participants in this workshop, especially during these tours. And the prompts is really for them to discover, make their own discoveries, and we create questions and kind of give them their own homework, right? And again, now it's going into connectivism, right? So it's like, how do you connect to these this setup that I've created, right? So so to directly answer your question, like if you were to use the AR that I created, like I did a bingo that I can share with folks, and like essentially the bingo features different questions of how they can like just become curious. So it's like, walk around the monument 3 times, and what do you discover? Like, you know, share with us, what do you discover? You know, what comes up for you? You know, well, it was like pre-lockdown time when I came up with some of these things, but it's like, when you touch the monument, what do you feel? What history comes to mind, you know? And then when you try to touch the AR next to the monument, what comes up then, you know? And so just having those moments of inquiries that then sparks conversations. So it's like, if you only think about colonial experience, then obviously there's something wrong there.